History is full of moments when empires believed their victories were inevitable, when sheer numbers, power, and prestige seemed enough to crush anyone standing in their way. But every now and then, a speck of land, a handful of men, and a single impossible stand rewrite the destiny of nations. The Siege of Malta in 1565 was one of those moments. A clash where courage outweighed arithmetic, where fortresses shook under oceans of fire, and where a tiny island forced the greatest empire of its age to bleed for every inch. What unfolded there was not merely a battle, it was a test of will. 40,000 seasoned Ottoman soldiers, veterans of 100 brutal campaigns, set foot on a small, sun-baked island in the heart of the Mediterranean. Their mission was simple and terrifying: wipe the Knights of St. John off the map and open a straight path toward Rome itself. Standing in their way were barely 500 knights, supported only by Maltese townsmen, hired mercenaries, and whoever else could hold a weapon. At first glance, it was hardly a battle at all. The Ottomans possessed one of the most formidable armies on earth. 200 war galleys, 70 thunderous cannons, and 6,000 Janissaries, the elite warriors who had carved their reputation through centuries of victories. Against them, the knights were outnumbered almost 10 to 1. And yet, they endured. For 4 relentless months, they refused to let the crescent banner advance. What happened on Malta during the summer of 1565 became a defining confrontation between a rising imperial superpower and a tiny Christian order determined to make its final stand matter. How did a lonely rock in the sea become the burial ground of an empire's ambition? What kind of resolve keeps a man fighting when 40,000 enemies close in around him? And what strange alchemy of terrain, tactics, and faith allowed a few hundred defenders to halt the Sultan's war machine? To understand this, you have to look at the map. Malta appears insignificant, nothing more than a speck between Sicily and North Africa. But that speck lay directly across the Central Sea routes linking Europe and the Middle East. In the 16th century, it was a keystone. Whoever controlled Malta commanded the heart of the Mediterranean. It was the final checkpoint blocking the Ottoman push toward Western Europe. After the Ottomans expelled them from Rhodes in 1522 and captured Tripoli in 1551, the Knights Hospitaller, warrior monks sworn to defend Christendom, were left wandering without a home. Retreat was not in their vocabulary. So when Emperor Charles V granted them Malta in 1530, they transformed the barren island into their last stronghold. For 30 years, they dug trenches, raised bastions, and fortified every inch of limestone. Their order was unlike anything else in Europe, a sovereign brotherhood with its own navy, its own laws, its own relentless code. Their motto said it plainly: defense of the faith, service to the poor. But defending the faith wasn't just ceremonial. The Knights aggressively disrupted Ottoman sea trade, seized Muslim vessels, freed Christian captives, and harassed merchant routes across the Mediterranean. Their leader during the siege, Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette, was well past 70, yet he still led men through sword-to-sword combat. He had spent a lifetime battling the Ottomans, and under him the Knights embraced guerre couverte, a form of sanctioned piracy. Their swift ships darted from Malta's harbors, striking Ottoman and even Venetian merchants trading with the Turks. They plundered cargo and prisoners like wolves of the sea. But every wolf eventually pushes too far. The turning point came when the Knights captured a colossal Ottoman merchantman owned by Kuster Aga, the Sultan's powerful chief eunuch. That wasn't just a raid, it was an insult. And no one insulted Suleiman the Magnificent without consequences. The empire responded with overwhelming force. Around 200 warships and 35 to 40,000 troops set sail for Malta, including 6,000 Janissaries, some of the finest infantry in the world. Their siege cannons were monstrous, capable of launching 600-pound stone balls across more than a mile. The Knights, by comparison, had only a few hundred fully trained members of the order. They were reinforced by Maltese militia, Spanish and Italian troops, and even enslaved men promised their freedom if they fought. It was one of the largest military operations of the century. Suleiman appointed two commanders. Mustafa Pasha, an experienced general who believed victory came from slow, crushing sieges, and Piali Pasha, a younger, ambitious admiral and the Sultan's relative by marriage, who thought in terms of naval dominance. Their partnership was doomed from the first day. Mustafa wanted to march inland and seize Medina, the old capital at the island center. Control the heart, he argued, and the rest would collapse. Piali insisted they must first take the harbors and secure safe anchorage for the fleet. Both strategies had merit, but they couldn't pursue both. Instead of decisiveness, the Ottoman command dissolved into arguments, hesitation, and bruised pride. Then a third figure entered the stage, Turgut Reis Dragut, the legendary corsair. A master of naval warfare, feared across the Mediterranean, Dragut's presence overshadowed both pashas. They pretended to welcome him, but each secretly dreaded being outshone. Dragut sided with Piali. Fort St. Elmo must fall first. This small, star-shaped fortress guarded the entrance to the great harbors, and capturing it would open the way to the Knights' main positions in Burgu and Singlia. When the Ottomans landed, they needed 10 full days just to drag their artillery ashore and prepare. St. Elmo had never been meant to endure a massive siege. Originally a lookout tower, it was expanded into a star fort only a decade earlier and could house a few hundred men. But its angled bastions, projecting like arrowheads, were state-of-the-art, designed to deflect cannon fire. Valette knew St. Elmo was doomed, but he also understood that every hour it held would delay the enemy and allow him to strengthen his real defenses across the harbor. So he devised a ruthless, brilliant strategy, a nightly rotation. Under cover of darkness, boats slipped fresh men, gunpowder, and supplies into the fort, while the wounded were ferried out. By day, the garrison fought until they dropped. By night, new defenders took their place. A siege expected to last a week dragged on for 35 agonizing days. Thousands of cannonballs turned St. Elmo into a shattered heap, yet somehow the defenders kept firing. Then the Ottomans suffered a disaster. Dragut was killed, either by a cannonball from the fort or by their own misfire. No one knows for certain, but everyone knew what his death meant. The empire had lost its greatest commander, and with him, whatever unity remained among its leaders. When Fort St. Elmo finally collapsed on June 23rd, the scene was nothing short of apocalyptic. The Ottomans had taken one of Malta's key defensive anchors, and by every military calculation, the rest of the island should have fallen like dominoes. But Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette had no intention of allowing that. Not then, not ever. The Turks offered him generous terms, honor in defeat, safe passage, an end to the slaughter. Valette rejected them without a moment's hesitation. He understood a crushing truth of warfare. The moment defenders allow themselves to imagine negotiation, the will to fight evaporates. Once you picture peace, you stop believing victory is possible. So Valette drew a different weapon from his arsenal, the spirit of his own people. He knew the siege would hinge as much on morale as on muskets. If civilians sat idle, fear would root itself in their hearts. But if they were constantly building, hauling, repairing, carrying powder under fire, they would channel their terror into purpose. And purpose, he believed, was stronger than panic. An idle mind invites despair. He might not have said aloud, but he acted on the idea relentlessly. Every man, woman, and child on Malta was given work, any work, to keep fear from festering. Still, the situation was dire. The fall of St. Elmo had been savagely cruel. Horrifying tales spread through the population, mutilated bodies, executions, and the severed heads of slain knights floating across the harbor as Ottoman taunts. Valette feared something more dangerous than the enemy camps beyond the walls, hopelessness creeping inside them. He worried that retreating soldiers, carrying trauma or fatalism, would infect the strongholds of Burgu and Singlia with doubt, a kind of moral plague. In siege warfare, morale is oxygen. Once it's gone, no wall is thick enough to save you. So Valette made a grim decision. He issued a bando, an order to execute every Ottoman prisoner that had been captured. The chilling part came next. The executions would not be carried out by soldiers, but by the civilians themselves. It was brutal, even by the brutal standards of the 16th century, but Valette's reasoning was strategic. By forcing Maltese townspeople to shed enemy blood with their own hands, he severed any psychological route to surrender. Once a community participates in violence, retreat ceases to be an option. It becomes a war of no return. Shocking as it was, the decree achieved its purpose. The horror welded the population together. Grief turned into fury. Fear hardened into resolve. From that moment onward, the idea of surrender became unthinkable. This moment exposes one of history's unsettling contradictions. The Knights of St. John were a Christian order sworn to charity and defense of the faith. Yet here was their Grand Master ordering what today we would label an atrocity. But in the worldview of the 1500s, a world still breathing the air of crusades, mercy could seem like a fatal weakness, and survival could justify almost anything. Out of the original 1,500 defenders of St. Elmo, nearly all were dead or dying. But their sacrifice had cost the Turks dearly, over 6,000 Ottoman casualties, including nearly half of the elite Janissaries. So after the fort finally fell, one might expect the Ottomans to roll effortlessly through the remaining defenses. They had spent more than a month pulverizing a small outpost into rubble. Now their full fury turned toward the Knights' main bastions, Burgu, later known as Vittoriosa, and Sunglia, proudly nicknamed Città Invicta, the unconquered city. What the Ottomans did not realize was that these two fortresses were not medieval relics at all. They were cutting-edge marvels of 16th century military engineering. Picture this. Medieval castles had tall walls, dramatic but perfect targets for cannon fire. Gunpowder changed all of that. The new European style of fortification, known as the Tres Italienne, flipped castle design inside out. Instead of towering vertical walls, architects built low, thick, angled ramparts designed to swallow cannonballs instead of shattering beneath them. Burgu and Sunglia were textbook masterpieces of this system. Each bastion covered the next with overlapping fields of fire, creating kill zones impossible to approach without catastrophic losses. In front of the walls, the knights carved enormous ditches, 20 feet deep in some places, making frontal assaults nearly suicidal. Additional layers of defense, like counterguards and outworks, funneled attackers into narrow corridors of death. But even genius fortifications mean nothing without ingenuity. And that was where the knights excelled. They treated the siege like a vast laboratory of survival, constantly improvising new defenses. The entire peninsula became a living experiment in anti-siege warfare. One of their most brilliant innovations came from the sea. The Ottomans planned a maritime assault on Sunglia, hoping to bypass Fort St. Angelo's guns. To stop them, the knights stretched a massive iron chain between Burgu and Sunglia, a floating barrier, and concealed wooden stakes beneath the surface like underwater spears. So when the Ottomans attempted a daring maneuver, dragging roughly 100 warboats across the peninsula to launch a surprise amphibious attack, they slammed directly into the hidden trap. The chain stopped them cold. The submerged stakes tore their boats apart. The assault died before it even began. But the surprises didn't end there. The Ottomans deployed impressive siege engines, giant wooden towers covered in wet animal hides to prevent burning and fitted with drawbridges to drop onto the walls. They fielded fortified shelters known as mantlets to protect advancing infantry. On paper, their siege technology was formidable. The knights and Maltese engineers responded with countermines, labyrinths of tunnels dug beneath Ottoman works. Underground, men grappled in total darkness, swinging pickaxes, knives, even bare fists. No gunfire, only the sound of iron striking bone and the muffled roars of men choking in dust. These were the forgotten battles beneath the surface. No mercy, no surrender. Above ground, the knights revealed another stroke of brilliance. Hidden artillery chambers built inside the ramparts, cannons concealed behind false masonry. When the Ottoman siege towers crept close, the knights unleashed chain shot, two iron balls linked by a chain, designed to tear masts and rigging at sea. Fired at close range, it ripped straight through wood, canvas, rope, and flesh alike. Imagine the moment. A towering siege engine rumbling forward, wrapped in animal hides, bristling with soldiers, its drawbridge nearly ready to drop onto the walls. Then, without warning, the concealed guns roared to life. The tower exploded into splinters. What had taken weeks to construct was reduced to ruins in seconds. By late August, after more than 3 months of unbroken violence beneath the burning Maltese sun, the once unstoppable Ottoman war machine, the same force that had cowed Europe for generations, finally began to fracture from within. Their vast encampment sprawled across Marsa, near the marshlands at the foot of the Grand Harbor. At first, it looked like a practical choice: flat terrain, easy supply access, and close enough to batter Burgu and Singlia with constant assaults. But the Maltese summer turned those marshes into a death trap. Stagnant pools, piles of rotting refuse, and the stench of thousands of unwashed bodies cooking under the heat created the perfect breeding ground for plague. Soon men started collapsing in their tents. Dysentery, known then as the bloody flux, tore through the ranks, followed by fever, infection, and typhus. Soldiers who had survived swords, musket balls, and burning pitch now writhed helplessly in filth, delirious with fever. The Ottoman army had no real medical infrastructure, no sanitation system, and their water quickly became contaminated. Disease accomplished what cannons could not. It gnawed the army from the inside out. Across the harbor, the defenders fared shockingly better. They boiled their water, separated the sick from the healthy, and kept their cramped quarters as clean as a besieged city possibly could. They were outnumbered, starving, and exhausted, but they stayed alive, and that gave them a quiet advantage far more decisive than numbers. By the end of August, the Ottoman host was still massive on paper, but in reality it was hollow, sick, drained, and losing the will to fight. Yet Mustafa Pasha refused to accept defeat. On August 7th, convinced the knights were on the edge of collapse, he launched one final, all-or-nothing assault on Burgu. The battle was savage. Waves of Janissaries surged forward, climbing over heaps of corpses to reach the walls. At several points, they nearly broke through. Smoke choked the air. The thunder of muskets mixed with screams and splintering stone. For hours, it seemed the fortress might finally fall. Then, from nowhere, destiny intervened. A tiny cavalry force from Dinah, barely a few dozen riders, led by Captain Vincenzo Anastasii, struck the Ottoman rear. Not the battle line, their field hospital. It was a small attack with an outsized impact. Anastasii's men cut down over 60 wounded soldiers and medical staff. News of the raid swept through the Ottoman ranks like a lightning bolt, and rumors warped it instantly. Word spread that the long-awaited Christian relief army from Sicily, the Gran Soccorso, had arrived. Panic erupted. Already weakened and fevered, Mustafa's soldiers believed they were about to be encircled. What should have been a decisive push turned into a confused rout. The Ottomans pulled back, leaving thousands of dead around the walls they had nearly conquered. The psychological wound was enormous. From that moment onward, they fought not only the knights, but a rising, suffocating fear. And the knights understood exactly how to exploit it. When Mustafa later considered withdrawing inland to regroup for the winter around Dinah, the tiny town, nearly empty, starving, and low on ammunition, executed one of the greatest bluffs of the entire siege. They fired their cannons at maximum, useless range, simply to make noise. To the Ottomans, it sounded like a fortress braced for battle. Mustafa was done gambling. He ordered a full retreat. Meanwhile, across the sea, salvation, long promised and long delayed, was finally approaching. Don Garcia de Toledo, the Spanish viceroy of Sicily, had held back his relief force for months, whether out of caution or strategy. But last he acted. His army, the Gran Soccorso, 8 to 10,000 strong and largely Spanish, set sail in early September. When they landed on Malta's northern coast, their banners might as well have been the sunrise itself. For the Ottomans, it was the breaking point. Their soldiers were sick, starving, terrified, and the storm season was approaching. The Mediterranean in September could trap fleets like a coffin. On September 8th, 1565, after 3 months and 3 weeks of unimaginable fighting, the Ottoman army broke camp. What had begun as one of the greatest invasion forces in imperial history staggered back to its ships, decimated by disease, hunger, and Maltese steel. Estimates vary, but between 25,000 and 35,000 Ottoman soldiers never left Malta. The illusion of Ottoman invincibility, the fear that had dominated Europe for decades, shattered on those sun-bleached cliffs. As for the defenders, the Knights Hospitaller became legends overnight. But Grand Master Jean Parisot de Valette understood something others missed. The Ottoman Empire might return stronger than before. So while celebrations still echoed across the island, he made a monumental decision. He would build an entirely new city, one that would turn Malta into an unbreakable shield. On the rocky Siberia's peninsula, overlooking the Grand Harbor and the ruins of Fort St. Elmo, construction began. In March 1566, less than a year after the siege, the first stone was laid for a city that would bear his name. Valette. Valette was engineered as a fortress masquerading as a capital. Its walls followed the Italian trace system, angled bastions that swallowed cannonballs, terraces that overlapped fields of fire, and a layout designed to funnel attackers into lethal crossfire. Every street, every gate, every bastion was built with one purpose. Malta would never again be caught unprepared. One chronicler wrote, "It was raised so that no enemy might ever hold that ground again." But the ripple effects traveled far beyond Malta's shores. Across Europe, the news of the siege ignited something long dormant: confidence. For decades, Christian powers had feared challenging the Ottomans at sea. But Malta's victory proved the empire could bleed, and that single truth changed everything. Just 6 years later, in 1571, the same renewed spirit forged the Holy League, Spain, Venice, the Papal States, and others, an alliance unthinkable only a generation earlier. Their combined fleet met the Ottomans at the Battle of Lepanto, the largest naval clash of the 16th century, and delivered another staggering blow to imperial ambitions. And it all began with a small island, a handful of knights, and a siege that should have been impossible.